Hello, this is the second part of my summary of Dr. Ahmad Ashraf's long article on Islamic political movements in 20th century Iran. The article first appeared in Encyclopedia Iranica in 2007 and was updated in 2012. If you want more details about Dr. Ashraf, see the first part of this video series. The article effectively divides into three sections. The first on developments in the period prior to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which I covered in the first video. Then political developments from 1979 onwards, which I'm going to skip altogether. And then thirdly, ideological divisions in Islamic movements and Islamic political ideologies in practice, which I'm going to cover in this video and the next, this being the longest section. So, ideological divisions in Islamic movements. The opposition and rivalry between the various Islamically inspired movements, Islamic pro-democracy reformist ideas, Islamic socialism and Islamic fundamentalism, results partly from the vested material and more immediate political and cultural interests of their adherents, but it is also derived from their different ideological orientations vis-à-vis four key related issues: Islam and modernity, Islam and militancy, Islam and economic policy, and lastly, above all, the degree of an individual's freedom in relation to God and the compatibility of Islam with democracy, human rights, gender equality, and the rights of minority groups. I'm just going to cover the first three of these in the present video. So, Islam and modernity. Despite the diversity of Islamic political movements in contemporary Iran, their conception of modernity was and remains relatively stable. It refers to certain ideas, institutions, norms, and practices associated with the West since the late 18th century. While the various Islamic movements differ in their analyses of the particular European historical processes and perspectives comprising modernity there in quotes, they nonetheless are shaped considerably by their respective responses to Western influences. Thus, the pro-democracy Islamic movements emphasize Islam's doctrinal recognition of the ideas of freedom and political participation, hence Islam's receptiveness to modern concepts of constitutionalism and individual rights. We'll talk about that much more in the next video. Then the socialist Islamic movements, again socialist there is in quotes, equate modernity with social and economic development combined with social justice and egalitarian distribution of wealth, similar to liberation theology as a form of Christian socialism and enjoying widespread support in Latin America. For their part, the fundamentalist Islamic movements, similar to their Christian, Hindu, and Jewish counterparts, vilify Western humanism and more specifically the underlying subjectivism inherent in modernity. The fundamentalist movements also uphold a moderate or deep belief in messianic millenarianism. In modern Iranian history, the deep conviction in the imminent coming of the Mahdi emerged for the first time in an extremist form in the ideological pronouncements of those that Dr. Ashraf refers to as the new fundamentalists. Meanwhile, fundamentalists criticize modernity as a product of Christianity and/or Western imperialism. Fundamentalist and socialist Islamic movements as well, like their Western counterparts, often criticize the stagnant conservative religious establishment for not utilizing modern technologies and modes of mass mobilization to fight back against anti-Islamic elements of the political establishment and modernity. Their more radical elements even advocate an Islam without clerics. In Iran, as elsewhere in the Islamic world, an ongoing debate is raging over which modern institutions, practices, and ideologies may be deemed to be consistent with Islam. Pro-democracy and socialist Islamic movements, despite their embrace of modernity, agree that some elements of Western modernity are inconsistent with Islamic doctrines and ought to be rejected. For pro-democracy Islam, these would include totalitarian state ambitions and even secular liberalism. And for Islamic socialism, the tenets of imperialism, capitalism, and consumerism are seen as counter to many egalitarian and Puritan Islamic values. Fundamentalist Islamic movements, despite their outright hostility towards the Western model of modernity, nevertheless agree that some elements of modernity are essential under new circumstances, such as modern science and technology and organizational skills. The essential cause of the animosity between fundamentalists on the one side and religious modernists, with both the pro-democracy and socialist leanings on the other, stems from controversy over humanism as a main element in modernity. Islam and militancy. Militant Islamic movements, whether with fundamentalist or socialist leanings, have significantly diverged from the moderate worldview of the mainstream religious establishment of the ulama and the popular Shiism of the masses. To mobilize their followers for radical political action, both fundamentalists and Islamic socialists have interjected the spirit of revolt into their interpretive framework of the principle of Amr bil Ma'ruf, enjoining what is proper or good, a principal religious duty in Islam, radicalizing the otherwise quietist discourses of millenarianism, jihad, and martyrdom. Now let's turn to this principle of enjoining good, Amr bil Ma'ruf. Since the advent of Islam in the 7th century, the topic of the legitimacy of resorting to physical force in resistance to oppression has been a key debate in interpreting this principle. From the very early days, two polarized perspectives emerged. Those who viewed Amr bil Ma'ruf merely as a moral standard for admonishing corrupt and unjust rulers and members of the Islamic community, and those who proclaimed it a mandatory religious justification for armed revolt against unjust rulers and their loyal subjects. The majority of Sunni and Shi'i scholars generally have upheld the former quietist reading of this principle, while certain movements since the early years of the advent of Islam, ranging from the Kharijites to more recent militant Islamic currents, have espoused the activist, combative reading of the principle. Millenarianism and Messianism. The quietist millenarianism of the majority of the ulama and of the masses simply anticipates the return of the Mahdi before an unspecified millennium to commence it. The expectant perspective has nurtured an attitude of quietism amongst most Twelver Shi'is for centuries, and more specifically since the Safavids. This orientation led to non-involvement in protest movements and accommodation with the established political order during the greater occultation of the Mahdi. If you watch the other video I did on Mahdism, that would be helpful here. The active millenarianism of the militants, on the other hand, anticipates the return of the Mahdi only after the millennium, having been inaugurated by the faithful themselves. Yet the earlier political fundamentalists, such as the Fedaiyan Islam and others, as well as the Islamic Socialists, adopted a more moderate version of militant millenarianism. Therefore, the doctrine of millenarianism and the return of the Mahdi remained at the periphery of Islamic political movements and the Islamic regime in the period of the 1980s and 90s, but has recently become more prominent. The activist idea of Amr al-Ma'ruf and the militant conception of messianic millenarianism required a new reading of the principles of jihad and martyrdom. There are two basic views of jihad in Islam, defensive and offensive. A fight to defend Islamic society against the aggression of the enemies of the faith is regarded as incumbent upon the faithful. The ulama and the masses adhere to that defensive idea of jihad. The legitimacy of offensive jihad, however, and more specifically a revolutionary call for jihad during the greater occultation of the Mahdi, is questionable in Twelver Shi'ism and has been strongly prohibited in numerous hadiths attributed to the Imams. While the ulama cast doubt on the legitimacy of offensive and revolutionary jihad during the absence of the Mahdi, militants have appropriated the idea of jihad to mean not only a duty to defend the Islamic community, but also as an offensive revolutionary strategy. I'll just mention in passing a third conception of jihad, which is popular amongst most Sufis and many Shi'is, is that of spiritual jihad. That is the idea of individual struggle to elevate the mundane existence of the faithful up to the realm of the sacred. One significant development in this period is linked to Ayatollah Murtaza Motahari, who, along with Ali Shariati, is considered as the ideologue of the Islamic Revolution, and for whom, on the one hand, he says there's complete agreement among scholars that the essence of jihad is defensive, not offensive, but at the same time, he advocated extending the notion of defensive jihad. This extended notion of defensive jihad included rebellion against tyrannical regimes. Quote, Islam says that we must fight those tyrants so as to deliver the oppressed from the claws of tyranny. This militant conception of jihad is also extended to the export of revolution. Quote, rushing to the defense of the oppressed, especially if they are Muslims, such as the Palestinians, is certainly permissible. In fact, it is obligatory. Finally, the idea of jihad is also extended to the defense of Islamic society against cultural aggression. So, and this is a quotation, when we say that the basis of jihad is defensive, we do not mean defensive in the limited sense of having to defend oneself when one is attacked with a sword, gun, or artillery shell. No, we mean that if one's being, one's material or spiritual values are aggressed, or in fact if something that mankind values and respects and which is necessary for mankind's prosperity and happiness is aggressed, then we are to defend it. The recent new fundamentalists go even further and propagate the idea that jihad is necessary and essential in expediting the coming of the Mahdi. Now we turn to militant conception of martyrdom. The activist reading of Amr al-Ma'ruf, millenarianism and jihad, in turn has evolved into an innovative interpretation of the meaning and significance of the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein. The popular Shi'ism of the masses is marked by such symbolic religious rituals as passion play, commemorating the martyrdom of the Imam, and collective mourning, which includes such practices as self-mutilation and flagellation by mourners. By contrast, the militancy interpretation of the martyrdom evolved in the 1970s to become a rallying call for making individual sacrifices to propagate the establishment of a utopian Islamic society or against the tyranny of the existing order. The turning point was the dissemination of Ali Shariati's idea of martyrdom in his lectures in the early 1970s, later published as Shahadat, and the publication of a provocative and controversial book on the immortal martyr Hussein ibn Ali by Ayatollah Ni'matullah Salahi Najafabadi. The interpretation of the martyrdom of the Imam by Shariati and Najafabadi initiated a new debate on the subject in the 1970s. Najafabadi believed that the Imam possessed a clear religio-political agenda when he mobilized a war against the usurpers of the Islamic government of his time. For his part, Shariati deviated from the traditionalist reading of martyrdom by propagating the idea that the Imam Hussein staged a war to set an example for his faithful Shi'is to be martyred as a dramatic act of protest and revolt against the tyranny of the established order. If you are not able to be a victor, be a martyr. And of course that quotation which I've put up on the screen, every day is Ashura, every place is Karbala. Next, let's turn to what Dr. Ashraf refers to as the new apocalyptic mood. The recent rise to power of new fundamentalists brought different readings to the activist conceptions of Amr bil-Ma'ruf, millenarianism, jihad, and martyrdom. The radicalization of Shi'i millenarianism, leading to the rise in the cult of the Mahdi, may be seen as a bold innovation by the neo-fundamentalists. It originates in a sort of extremist Shi'ism, a well-known and recurrent movement in the history of Shi'ism. The new apocalyptic mood helped the burgeoning of the Janakaran edifice near Qum, believed to be the abode of the hidden Imam. Believing that the well of the mosque in Janakaran is the host of the Mahdi, the faithful Shi'is drop prayers and personal requests therein. The new fundamentalists brought for the first time the idea of imminent anticipation of the return of the hidden Imam to a central place in the politics of the Islamic Republic. They have expressed on various occasions their deep belief in the universality of the return of the Mahdi, his imminent return to form a divinely ordained state throughout the world. To expedite the appearance of the hidden Imam, they call for revolutionary mobilization and confrontation with the enemies of Islam through jihad and martyrdom. The cult of the Mahdi is replacing the historical place of the drama of the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein. The drama of martyrdom for the return of the Mahdi is even more inciting and more real in the mind of believers than the commemoration of the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein. It shifts the orientation from the past to the imminent future. The new cult of the Mahdi, however, encountered growing criticism from the sources of emulation to religious intellectuals of both pro-democracy and socialist camps, who often accused it of spreading superstition in society. Finally, in the present video, let's turn to Islam and economic policy. The controversy over the priority of public or private sectors became the main point of contradiction and dividing lines in factional politics during the period of 1982-89. In control of the state apparatus during the time of the war with Iraq, the radical left championed land distribution among the peasantry, nationalization of foreign trade, imposing limitations on the ownership of urban real estate, and progressive labor laws. Both Ali Shariati and Ayatollah Motahari provided the Islamic left with a socialist platform, while Shariati contributed to such rhetorical slogans as divinely ordained classless society or wretched of the earth. Motahari's contribution was mainly a moderate and systematic treatment of an Islamic economic system as mediating between socialism and capitalism, public and private spheres of the economy. On the other side were pro-democracy groups, right-wing fundamentalists and pragmatists with modern capitalist agendas who fought for private ownership and freedom of economic activities. The right-wing fundamentalists even opposed the establishment of a minimum wage or any control by the state over economic enterprises, arguing that capital and labor are in constant interaction in the Islamic free market and that labor accepts the proposed wage of its own free will. Thus, no intervention by the state in the economic life of the community should be permitted. However, the neo-fundamentalists, with their populist agenda, have adopted more support for the public sector at the cost of private enterprises. I'll talk about human rights and democracy, obviously a major point of contention between the various Islamic groups, in the next video. So many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Ian Palin and Tricia Williams. If you like these videos, you're welcome to subscribe to my channel. I'll try to answer any questions you may have about this video, either on Patreon or in a future video. Those of you who want to support the development of the channel can do so through either Patreon or PayPal. I'll give details below the video. Also, please click the like button. Have a good day.